The scream of dying horses echoed across the muddy fields of Mohawks, as the last Hungarian knights fell beneath Ottoman sabers. Yet hundreds of miles away, in the marble corridors of Topkapi Palace, the real battle for the empire's future was being fought not with steel, but with silk and whispered words. Harem Sultan, the red-haired concubine who had captured the heart of Suleiman the Magnificent, stood at her latticed window watching the Bosphorus shimmer in the morning light, knowing that every military victory her beloved sultan achieved on distant battlefields would ultimately strengthen her own position within the velvet cage of the Imperial Harem. The news of the victory at Mohawks had arrived 3 days earlier, carried by swift-footed messengers who bore the Sultan's personal seal. King Louis II of Hungary lay dead, his crown now within Ottoman grasp, but Harem understood that conquest meant more than territorial expansion. Each new province brought fresh tribute, new trade routes, and most importantly, new political alliances that could shift the delicate balance of power within the palace walls. As she prepared for the morning ritual of receiving the other women of the harem, Harem's mind calculated the implications of this victory with the precision of a grand vizier. The imperial harem was no mere collection of beautiful women awaiting their master's pleasure. It was a sophisticated political institution where the mothers of princes, the daughters of conquered nobility, and the most favored concubines wielded influence that could determine the fate of nations. The utmost authority in the imperial harem, the valid sultan, ruled over the other women in the household. Yet Harem, though not yet holding the title of valid sultan, had already begun to accumulate the kind of power that would make her a force to be reckoned with in Ottoman politics. The architecture of the harem itself reflected this hidden power structure. Behind the ornate screens and through the secret passages, information flowed like water through carefully constructed channels. The chief black eunuch, who served as intermediary between the harem and the outside world, had become one of Harem's most valuable allies. Through him, she learned of the sultan's military plans, the concerns of the grand vizier, and the shifting loyalties of provincial governors. All she had learned was the most precious currency in the Ottoman court. As Harem descended the marble steps toward the central courtyard where the other women waited, she reflected on how far she had come from her origins as a captured slave from the distant lands of Rith. The Battle of Mohawks had not only secured Ottoman dominance over Hungary, but it also demonstrated Suleiman's military genius to the world. This victory would strengthen his position among the powerful military caste that could make or break sultans, and a stronger sultan meant greater opportunities for the women who shared his intimate confidence. The morning light filtered through the intricate geometric patterns of the harem's windows, casting dancing shadows on the silk carpets beneath her feet. Each step brought her closer to the daily council where the most influential women of the court would gather to discuss not merely domestic matters, but the subtle political currents that would shape the empire's future. The victory at Mohawks had created new possibilities, new alliances to be forged, and new rivals to be neutralized. According to research from Princeton University's Department of Near Eastern Studies, the exercise of political power was tied to definitions of sexuality within the Ottoman system, making the harem a unique space where traditional notions of feminine influence were transformed into genuine political authority. Harem paused at the entrance to the council chamber, her hand resting on the cool metal of the door handle. Beyond this threshold lay the complex world of Ottoman court politics where every gesture carried meaning, every alliance could shift the balance of power, and every decision might echo across the empire from the battlefields, Hungary to the trading posts of the Indian Ocean. The Battle of Mohawks had been won with swords and cannons, but the wars that would determine the true shape of the Ottoman future would be fought here, in the silk-draped halls of the imperial harem, where women wielded power through intelligence, manipulation, and an understanding of the human heart that no military commander could hope to match. The autumn winds of 1529 carried more than the scent of dying leaves through the corridors of Topkapi Palace. They bore the weight of imperial ambition as Suleiman the Magnificent prepared for his most audacious campaign yet. The Siege of Vienna, the gateway to the heart of Christian Europe. In the harem Sultan felt the electric tension that preceded great military ventures, but her attention was focused on a different kind of battlefield where the weapons were whispered conversations and the casualties were measured in lost influence rather than spilled blood. The architectural genius of the harem was not merely aesthetic but deeply political. The complex was divided into distinct quarters, each serving different functions in the elaborate hierarchy of Ottoman court life. The quarters of the novice girls, known as the Esimi, were separated from the apartments of the ghost, the women who had caught the Sultan's eye, who in turn lived apart from the ICBL, those who had achieved the status of official favorites. At the apex of this carefully constructed pyramid stood the apartments of the Kadin Effendi, the official wives, and above them all, the chambers of the valid Sultan, the mother of the reigning emperor. Harem's current position as second consort placed her in a precarious but potentially powerful situation. The first consort, Mahida Fran Sultan, had already borne Suleiman a son, Prince Mus, who was widely regarded as the heir apparent. Yet Harem possessed something that mere precedents could not provide: the Sultan's passionate love and, more importantly, his intellectual respect. She had learned to read and write not only in Turkish but in Persian and Arabic, making her one of the few women in the harem capable of understanding the complex diplomatic correspondence that flowed through the palace. The morning of Suleiman's departure for Vienna, her room stood in the Tower of Justice, the symbolic heart of Ottoman power. Watching as the Sultan reviewed his troops in the courtyard below, the Janissaries, resplendent in their white felt caps, stood in perfect formation while the Sipahi cavalry, their horses pawing the ground impatiently, awaited the order to march. The sight should have filled her with pride, but instead Harem felt the familiar chill of political calculation. Every military campaign created opportunities for rivals to advance their positions, and the months of the Sultan's absence would be crucial in determining the future balance of power within the harem. The system of influence within the Ottoman court was far more complex than the European understanding of royal mistresses might suggest. The women of the harem were not merely competing for sexual favor, but were engaged in a sophisticated political game where alliances shifted like sand dunes in the desert wind. The chief black eunuch, who controlled access to the Sultan and served as the primary conduit of information between the harem and the Imperial divan, had become a kingmaker in his own right. His support could elevate a concubine to the status of consort, just as his opposition could doom even the most favored woman to obscurity. As the military procession began its march toward the gates of the palace, Harem retreated to her private chambers to begin the delicate work of maintaining her influence during the Sultan's absence. The network of informants she had carefully cultivated over the years included not only eunuchs of female attendants but also the wives and daughters of high-ranking officials who visited the harem for various ceremonial functions. Through these connections, she could monitor the political temperature of the capital, track the movements of potential rivals, and most importantly, ensure that her own interests were protected while Suleiman campaigned in distant lands. The art of harem politics required a unique blend of traditional feminine skills and sophisticated political acumen. A woman might use her knowledge of poetry to compose verses that would flatter a powerful eunuch, while simultaneously encoding messages about shifting alliances. She might employ her skills in embroidery to create gifts that would cement important friendships, while subtly displaying her own wealth and status. The daily rituals of the harem, the communal baths, the shared meals, the evening entertainments all served as opportunities for gathering intelligence and building the coalitions that would determine who rose and who fell in the empire's hidden hierarchy. As the dust of the departing army settled over the palace courtyard, Harem understood that the siege of Vienna would be decided not only by the courage of Ottoman soldiers but by the political maneuvers of the women who remained behind in Istanbul. The coming months would test every skill she had acquired in her rise from captured slave to imperial favorite, and the outcome would determine whether she would continue her ascent toward the ultimate prize, the position of valid sultan, the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire. While Suleiman's army laid siege to the ancient walls of Vienna, a different kind of warfare consumed the marble halls of Topkapi Palace. The physical distance between the Sultan and his harem had created a power vacuum that threatened to tear apart the delicate political fabric Harem Sultan had spent years weaving. News from the Austrian front arrived sporadically, each dispatch scrutinized not merely for military intelligence but for subtle clues about the Sultan's mood, his health, and most critically, his continued favor toward those he had left behind. The morning ritual of receiving intelligence had become Harem's most important daily ceremony. In the privacy of her chambers, she would meet with the chief black eunuch, whose network of spies and informants extended from the palace kitchens to the Sultan's personal tent on the battlefields of Europe. The news was troubling. The siege of Vienna was not proceeding as smoothly as anticipated. The Austrian defenders, led by Count Nicholas Sohm, had proven more resilient than expected, and the onset of an early winter was taking its toll on the Ottoman forces. More disturbing still were the reports of Prince Mustafa's growing influence within the military hierarchy. Mahidevran Sultan's son, now 16 and demonstrating considerable military aptitude, had been granted permission to accompany his father on campaign. This decision, which had seemed routine when announced, now appeared to be a strategic masterstroke by the first consort. While Harem remained confined to the harem, bound by the traditional restrictions placed on imperial women, her rival's son was gaining invaluable experience in building relationships with the very men who would one day choose the next sultan. The political implications of Prince Mustafa's presence at Vienna extended far beyond simple military training. According to historical research from the harem became a place that exerted influence on imperial decisions, but this influence was meaningless if the future sultan had already formed his political alliances before ascending to the throne. Every day that Mustafa spent in the company of the Grand Vizier, the commanders of the Janissaries, and the provincial governors who had joined the campaign was a day that strengthened his position as heir apparent. Harem's response to this challenge demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of power that had enabled her rise within the Ottoman hierarchy. Rather than retreating into despair or attempting futile direct confrontation with Mahid, she chose to expand her own network of influence within the capital. The wives of the officials who remained in Istanbul became her primary targets, as these women possessed their own channels of communication with their husbands serving in the military. Through carefully orchestrated social gatherings, charitable activities, and religious observances, Harem began to build a coalition of support that would serve her interests regardless of the outcome at Vienna. The strategy of indirect influence had deep roots in Ottoman court culture. Women who could not participate directly in the divan, the Sultan's council, had developed alternative methods of political engagement that were often more effective than formal governmental processes. The traditional Friday prayers at the palace mosque provided opportunities for discreet conversations about policy matters. The elaborate ceremonies surrounding religious festivals created settings where important alliances could be forged through carefully choreographed demonstrations of respect and mutual support. As autumn deepened and the news from Vienna grew increasingly grim, Harem made a decision that would define her political legacy. Rather than simply waiting for the Sultan's return, she chose to actively shape the narrative of the campaign through her network of correspondents and informants. The letters she arranged to be sent to Suleiman carry not only expressions of personal devotion, but subtle political intelligence about the situation in the capital, carefully crafted to remind the Sultan of her unique value as both intimate companion and political advisor. The siege of Vienna ended in October with Ottoman withdrawal, the first major military setback of Suleiman's reign. But for Harem, the real victory lay not in the outcome of the battle but in the political position she had secured during the Sultan's absence. The network of alliances she had built within the harem and the broader court hierarchy had not only survived the test of prolonged separation, but had actually When Suleiman returned to Istanbul, he would find that his redhead consort had used the months of his absence to transform herself from mere favorite into an indispensable political partner whose influence extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of the imperial harem. The failure at Vienna had taught the Ottoman Empire important lessons about the limits of military expansion, but it had also demonstrated the growing power of the harem as a political institution. The women who had once been seen primarily as sources of pleasure and procreation were increasingly recognized, essential participants in the complex process of imperial governance. The morning of her wedding to Suleiman, the magnificent Harem Sultan stood before the mirror in her private chambers, watching as her attendants draped her in robes of cloth of gold that had been woven with threads imported from distant China. The ceremony that would take place that afternoon would be unprecedented in Ottoman history. Never before had a sultan legally married a woman who had been his concubine. Yet Harem understood that this public elevation was merely the formal recognition of a political transformation that had been years in the making. The path to this moment had been paved with careful calculation and strategic patience. Following Suleiman's return from the unsuccessful siege of Vienna, Harem had recognized that her position as second consort, while elevated, remained vulnerable to the shifting allegiances of court politics. The birth of her son Mehmed in 1530 had strengthened her position considerably, but it had also intensified the rivalry with Mahidevran Sultan, whose son Mustafa remained the acknowledged heir apparent. The solution to this dilemma required a bold stroke that would permanently alter the balance of power within the harem. The decision to marry Harem represented more than a romantic gesture on Suleiman's part. It was a calculated political move that demonstrated the Sultan's confidence in his own authority and his willingness to break with tradition when it served his interests. The marriage would elevate Harem to the status of Haseki Sultan, a title that carried with it not only ceremonial importance but genuine political power. As the Sultan's legal wife, she would have the right to participate in certain governmental functions that had previously been denied to her as a concubine. The ceremony itself was conducted with unprecedented magnificence, designed to send a clear message about Harem's new status to both the Ottoman court and the broader Islamic world. The wedding feast lasted for 7 days, with entertainments that included poetry, musical performances, and elaborate displays of the empire's wealth and power. Foreign ambassadors were invited to witness the celebrations, ensuring that news of this remarkable elevation would spread throughout the courts of Europe and the Islamic world. The political implications of the marriage extended far beyond the immediate benefits to Harem herself. The elevation of a former slave to the position of Sultan's wife challenged traditional notions of social hierarchy and demonstrated the meritocratic aspects of Ottoman society that had contributed to the empire's remarkable expansion. It also signaled a shift in the nature of the Sultanate itself, from a traditional warrior monarchy toward a more sophisticated imperial system that recognized the importance of political partnership and shared governance. The reaction within the harem to Harem's elevation was swift and predictable. Mahidevran Sultan, who had previously held the superior position as first consort, found herself suddenly relegated to a secondary role that threatened not only her own status but the future prospects of her son. The traditional alliance between the mothers of princes began to fracture as the women of the harem recalculated their political positions in light of this unprecedented change in the imperial household structure. Harem's response to these challenges demonstrated the political sophistication that had enabled her rise to power. Rather than attempting to humiliate her former rival or engage in petty disputes over precedence, she chose to focus on expanding her influence within the broader governmental apparatus. The marriage had given her access to information and decision-making processes that had previously been closed to her, and she moved quickly to establish herself as an indispensable advisor to the Sultan on matters ranging from military strategy to economic policy. The transformation of Harem from concubine to wife represented a fundamental shift in the nature of Ottoman court politics. According to historical analysis from recent scholarship, women in the harem did indeed begin to wield considerable influence in Ottoman political life from the mid-16th century onwards, and Harem's marriage marked the beginning of what historians would later term the Sultanate of Women, a period when the mothers and wives of sultans exercised unprecedented political power. The wedding ceremony concluded with Harem's formal presentation to the people of Istanbul, who gathered in the squares and streets surrounding Topkapi Palace to witness this historic moment. The cheers of the crowd, carefully orchestrated by the palace administration, served as public validation of her new status and a warning to any who might question her authority. As she stood beside Suleiman on the palace balcony, acknowledging the acclamations of the crowd, Harem understood that she had achieved something that no woman in Ottoman history had accomplished before: the transformation of personal influence into formal political power. The death of Prince Mehmed, Harem Sultan's eldest son, the prince who had been groomed as a potential successor to his father, succumbed to smallpox at the age of 21, leaving behind a political vacuum that threatened to destabilize the entire imperial succession. As Harem knelt beside her son's deathbed in the private chambers of the palace, her grief was compounded by the cold calculation of political necessity. The death of Mehmed had fundamentally altered the balance of power within the royal family and potentially sealed the fate of her remaining sons. The immediate aftermath of the prince's death revealed the sophisticated intelligence network that Harem had constructed over the years of her ascendancy. Within hours of Mehmed's passing, messengers had been dispatched to inform Suleiman, who was campaigning in Hungary, and two key political figures throughout the empire. The speed and efficiency of these communications demonstrated not only Harem's organizational capabilities, but also her understanding that in the Ottoman system, information was often more valuable than armies in determining political outcomes. The funeral of Prince Mehmed became a stage for the complex political theater that characterized Ottoman court life. The ceremony, conducted with imperial magnificence at the Kazade Mosque, drew representatives from across the empire and beyond. Foreign ambassadors attended not merely to pay their respects but to observe the political dynamics that would shape the succession. The positioning of various court officials, the precedence given to different members of the royal family, and the subtle signals exchanged between political factions all carried profound implications for the future of the empire. Mahidevran Sultan's reaction to her rival's loss revealed both the intensity of their competition and the sophisticated understanding of power characterized the women of the Ottoman harem. While she observed the traditional courtesies of mourning, her increased confidence was evident to those who understood the subtle language of court politics. The death of Mehmed had removed the most immediate threat to her son Mustafa's succession, but it had also created new opportunities for Harem's surviving sons, Selim and Bayezid, who were now thrust into more prominent positions within the imperial hierarchy. The challenge facing Harem in the wake of Mehmed's death was how to protect her remaining sons while maintaining her own political influence. The Ottoman tradition of royal fratricide, while not yet formally created an environment where the survival of princes depended not only on their personal capabilities, but on their mother's political skills. Harem's response to this challenge demonstrated the strategic thinking that had enabled her rise to power and would ultimately define her historical legacy. The solution she devised was characteristically subtle and, rather than attempting to directly challenge Mustafa's position as heir apparent, Harem chose to focus on strengthening the institutional power of the harem itself. She expanded her charitable activities, funding the construction of mosques, schools, and hospitals that would serve as permanent monuments to her piety and generosity. These projects not only enhanced her reputation among the common people, but also created networks of obligation and gratitude that could be mobilized for political purposes. The correspondence between Harem and Suleiman during this period reveals the depth of their political partnership and the extent to which she had become integral to the functioning of the imperial government. Her letters, written in an elegant hand that demonstrated her mastery of Ottoman literary conventions, combined expressions of personal devotion with sophisticated political analysis. She provided the Sultan with intelligence about the situation in the capital, assessments of the loyalty of various officials, and recommendations for policy decisions that would affect the entire empire. The impact of Mehmed's death on the broader political landscape of the Ottoman Empire cannot be overstated. The prince had been widely regarded as the most capable of Suleiman's sons, and his loss created uncertainty about the future direction of the empire. The death also intensified the rivalry between the supporters of the various remaining princes, leading to the formation of political factions that would eventually tear the empire apart. Harem's ability to navigate these dangerous waters while protecting her own interests and those of her surviving sons would prove to be one of the most remarkable political achievements of the 16th century. As the year 1541 drew to a close, Harem Sultan found herself in the paradoxical position of being both more powerful and more vulnerable than ever before. The death of her eldest son had removed one of the foundations of her political strength, but it had also forced her to develop new strategies and alliances that would ultimately prove even more effective. The mother of princes had become something unprecedented in Ottoman history, a woman whose political influence extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of the harem and into the very heart of imperial governance. The spring of 1558 brought to Istanbul winds that carried both the promise of renewal and the whisper of mortality. Harem Sultan, now in her 55th year, stood at the pinnacle of her political power, yet she could feel the inexorable approach of the moment, when all her carefully constructed influence would be tested by the ultimate transition: the death of Suleiman the Magnificent and the accession of a new sultan. The question that haunted her private moments was not whether she would survive this transition, but whether the political system she had helped create would endure beyond her own lifetime. The intervening years since Prince Mehmed's death had seen Harem transformed from a mere participant in Ottoman court politics into one of its primary architects. Her influence now extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of the harem, reaching into the Grand Vizier's office, the treasury, and even the military hierarchy. The network of alliances she had constructed included not only the women of the imperial household, but also the wives and daughters of the empire's most powerful men, creating a shadow government that operated through informal channels but wielded very real power. The execution of Prince Mustafa in 1553 had marked the culmination of one of the most sophisticated political campaigns in Ottoman history. The elimination of Mahidevran Sultan's son had not been accomplished through direct confrontation, but through a carefully orchestrated series of events that convinced Suleiman that his eldest son represented a threat to imperial unity. The campaign had required years of patient preparation, involving the placement of loyal informants in key positions, the cultivation of suspicion among Mustafa's supporters, and the strategic dissemination of information that painted the prince as a potential rebel. The aftermath of Mustafa's death had secured the succession for Harem's sons, but it had also created new challenges that tested her political skills to their limits. The execution of a popular prince had generated significant opposition within the military hierarchy, particularly among the Janissaries who had admired Mustafa's martial prowess. Harem's response to this crisis had demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of Ottoman political culture and her ability to adapt her strategies to changing circumstances. The key to managing the fallout from Mustafa's execution lay in Harem's recognition that legitimacy in the Ottoman system derived not merely from bloodline, but from demonstrated competence and piety. She had worked tirelessly to present her surviving sons as worthy successors to their father, arranging for them to receive the best possible education and ensuring that they gained practical experience in governance. Prince Selim had been appointed to govern important provinces, while Prince Bayezid had been given command of military units, allowing both to build their own networks of support. The charitable activities that Harem had initiated years earlier had by 58 grown into a massive philanthropic enterprise that rivaled the official governmental apparatus in scope and influence. The Harem Sultan complex in Istanbul, which included a mosque, a school, a hospital, and a public bath, served as a permanent monument to her piety and generosity. Similar projects in other cities throughout the empire created a network of institutions that bore her name and celebrated her contributions to Islamic civilization. The correspondence between Harem and foreign dignitaries during this period reveals the extent to which she had become recognized as a significant political figure in her own right. Letters from European ambassadors, Persian and North African rulers were addressed directly to her, acknowledging her influence over Ottoman policy and seeking her support for their various initiatives. This international recognition represented a fundamental shift in diplomatic protocol and demonstrated the unique position she had carved out within the imperial system. The death of Harem Sultan in April 1558 marked the end of an era in Ottoman history. Her funeral, conducted with imperial magnificence, drew mourners from across the empire and beyond. The elaborate ceremonies that accompanied her burial in the mausoleum she had commissioned beside the mosque served as both a celebration of her achievements and a statement about the permanent place she had secured in Ottoman political culture. The immediate aftermath of Harem's death revealed the extent to which she had transformed the nature of power within the Ottoman system. Her sons, now left to navigate the treacherous waters of succession politics without her guidance, would soon discover that the networks of influence she had constructed were not easily transferable. The political institutions she had helped create would endure, but the personal relationships and loyalties that had made them effective would need to be rebuilt by the next generation of palace women. The legacy of Harem Sultan extended far beyond her immediate political achievements. She had demonstrated that women could wield significant power within the Ottoman system, but she had also shown that such power required constant vigilance, sophisticated strategic thinking, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The Sultanate of women that historians would later identify as a defining characteristic of the late Ottoman period had its origins in the precedents she established and the political culture she helped create. The death of Suleiman the Magnificent in September 15, before the wars of in Hungary, marked the end of the Ottoman Empire's golden age and the beginning of a new era shaped by the institutional changes that Harem Sultan had helped to create. Though she had died 8 years earlier, her influence continued to reverberate through the marble halls of Topkapi Palace as her son Selim ascended to the throne as Selim II, becoming the first Ottoman Sultan whose path to power had been secured primarily through the political maneuvering of his mother rather than his own military prowess. The succession of Selim represented the triumph of a new model of Ottoman governance that elevated political sophistication over traditional warrior virtues. The new Sultan, who had spent his pre-imperial years governing the province of Manisa rather than commanding armies in the field, brought to the throne a different set of skills and priorities than his predecessors. His reign would be characterized not by dramatic military conquests but by the consolidation of administrative systems and the expansion of the cultural and intellectual institutions that had been championed by his mother. The influence of Harem's political legacy was most clearly visible in the continued prominence of the imperial harem as a center of political power. Nurbanu Sultan, the mother of the future Murad III, had learned from Harem's example and had begun to construct her own network of influence within the palace hierarchy. The precedents established by Harem had created a template for how imperial women could accumulate and exercise power, transforming what had once been an informal system of influence into a recognized political institution. The architectural monuments that Harem had commissioned during her lifetime served as permanent reminders of her contributions to Ottoman civilization. The Harem Sultan complex in Istanbul continued to provide services to the people of the capital, while similar projects in other cities bore witness to the scope of her philanthropic activities. These buildings, with their elegant proportions and sophisticated decoration, represented not merely charitable gestures but strategic investments in the kind of soft power that would outlast any individual ruler. The diplomatic protocols that had evolved during Harem's lifetime, which recognized the political importance of imperial women, continued to shape Ottoman foreign relations long after her death. European ambassadors continued to seek audiences with the mothers and wives of Sultans, recognizing that these women possessed genuine influence over policy decisions. The letters and memoirs of foreign diplomats from this period frequently comment on the sophisticated political culture of the Ottoman court and the important role played by women in the imperial system. The military campaigns that followed Suleiman's death revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the political system that had emerged during Harem's era. The conquest of Cyprus in 1571 demonstrated that the Ottoman Empire remained a formidable military power. But the victory at Lepanto in the same year by the Holy League showed that the empire's enemies had learned to counter its traditional advantages. The political culture that emphasized negotiation and compromise over military confrontation would prove better suited to managing these new challenges than the warrior ethos of earlier generations. The cultural flowering that characterized the late 16th century Ottoman Empire owed much to the patronage systems Harem had established and the precedents she had set for imperial women's involvement in intellectual and artistic endeavors. The poets, architects, and scholars who produced some of the empire's greatest works during this period often enjoyed the support of palaced women, who had learned from Harem's example that cultural patronage could be an effective form of political influence. The evolution of Ottoman succession practices in the generations following Harem's death reflected the lasting impact of her political innovations. The system of royal fratricide, while never formally abolished, gradually gave way to more sophisticated methods of managing succession that took into account the political networks and alliances that had been built around various candidates. The mothers of princes continued to play crucial roles in these processes, but they did so within institutional frameworks that had been shaped by Harem's precedents. The historical assessment of Harem Sultan's legacy has varied over the centuries, with different generations of scholars emphasizing different aspects of her remarkable career. Some have focused on her role in the decline of Ottoman military effectiveness, arguing that the shift from warrior princes to palace-educated rulers weakened the empire's martial traditions. Others have emphasized her contributions to Ottoman cultural and intellectual life, noting that the institutions she supported produced some of the empire's greatest achievements in art, architecture, and literature. The final measure of Harem Sultan's historical significance lies not in any single achievement but in the transformation of Ottoman political culture that she had helped to bring about. The sultanate of women that characterized much of the empire's later history was neither accidental nor inevitable, but was the result of conscious political choices made by a remarkable woman who understood that lasting power required more than personal charisma or sexual appeal. It required the construction of institutions, the cultivation of alliances, and the patient work of building the kind of political culture that could survive the death of any individual ruler. As the 16th century drew to a close, the Ottoman Empire that Harem Sultan had helped to shape faced new challenges that would test the resilience of the political system she had helped to create. The religious wars that convulsed Europe, the economic disruptions caused by the discovery of the Americas, and the technological innovations that were transforming warfare all demanded adaptive responses from the Ottoman leadership. The political culture that emerged from the Imperial Harem during this period would prove to be one of the empire's most valuable assets in meeting these challenges, demonstrating that the influence of a single extraordinary woman could shape the destiny of one of history's greatest empires for generations to come.